For the sake of clarity, I am well aware of the ambiguity packed into the title of this video. What Aikido means today is somewhat subjective and contentious, even if outside observers tend to think Aikido refers to a singular monolithic style when it in fact does not. Beyond this, my video is in English, and that almost certainly excludes the possibility of major Aikido organizations becoming aware of it. Not to mention, the pretty insignificant size of my channel doesn't help. However, this video is addressed to the Aikido sphere more generally. Organizations, teachers, practitioners, interested observers, and even critics. I want to describe to you some personal experiences I've had over the last couple years regarding this art form. Nothing I am about to say comes from a place of vitriol or a desire to stir up drama. If anything, this video is more of an exercise in personal catharsis than an expectation that something will change. The first standout experience was how my belt rank has been handled in Japan by Aikido organizations. I am not going to go into a massive deep dive of my own lineage here because, frankly, I think lineages are generally useless in terms of skill assessment and that instead are primarily useful for historians and researchers. I do, however, believe that it is my lineage that has caused so much resistance to acquiring organizational recognition. Specifically, I am something of a lineage mutt. I hold rank that is built upon both Aikikai and Yoshinkan influences. My most recent certification is technically through the Yoshinkan, but I'm honestly not even sure if it would be recognized after the institutional implosion that occurred to the Yoshinkan a few years back. I'll get into why I suspect all of this resistance later. Beyond this, although less of an issue, it has been something that occasionally comes up. I hold rank in Judo and Karate. I am second degree black belt in all of my styles and was preparing for third degree in Aikido specifically before unrelated events returned me to Japan. I also must state that I've never in my whole martial arts tenure really cared all that much about bell ranks and examinations. In fact, I'm notorious for being very slow about taking examinations for this exact reason. I'm also generally a believer that the best way to assess someone's skill is to just train with them. My reason for chasing a rank in Japan is less about the color around my waist or some vague sense of authority, but more about paperwork, so I show up in an organization's register and have more freedom to train without being shunted into the white belt corner every time I enter a new dojo. One final piece of context here is that I've been doing Aikido specifically since I was about 12 or 13. Technically, even earlier, since some of its techniques were baked into my home dojo's karate curriculum, which was very much into cross-training. I also trained essentially full-time in a Japanese university under Aikikai purview for 3 years between 2017 and 2020. In other words, I'm sitting on about 20 years of Aikido experience across 2 styles, have a ludicrous number of training hours invested, and have experience in a couple other Japanese martial arts. I bring this to your attention because I've been repeatedly told by an Aikikai affiliate that if I want to test, I will need to test for first Q. This is the belt rank before black and about 4 ranks below what my level roughly is currently. I have tried to compromise on this offer multiple times. Forget about letting me test Sandan, fine, I'll just test Nidan, my actual current rank back in the States. That was rejected. Okay, fine, let me test for first degree black belt, Shodan. That was rejected. Okay, let me double test in the same day. I'll take the first Q test and the first degree black belt test. It'll be a cardio and fitness challenge, but I'm down for that. You guessed it, this was also rejected. I've considered sucking it up and taking the first Q exam just to have my name on some paperwork somewhere, but I can't help but feel like this friction is manufactured. First of all, I have a long relationship with the would-be proctor of this examination. While I wouldn't suggest we are the world's biggest fans of one another, I've always been thankful for and respectful of this person because of what he's built in the university system. I've never done anything to my knowledge to slight him one way or the other personally. More to the point, he knows I've trained hard. We are not strangers. Second, I've been to plenty of dojos in Japan, and while I don't want to toot my own horn, I'm frankly just way above the average first kyu holder. Even at the university, where I'd say a first kyu holder is probably closer to a shodan or nidan relative to most hobbyists in town dojos, I still can out-cardio these people, and I simply just know more techniques than them. I can reproduce whatever a teacher is doing pretty quickly. Finally, were I to accept these terms and take the first kyu examination, I'd essentially be set back about 6 years because of mandatory wait times between tests. In other words, it would be nearly 6 years before I could attempt to test for what I've already been preparing for since about 2022. That is also assuming I'm not met with more manufactured resistance somewhere along that timeline. So why is this happening? I'm not a mind reader, but I will say my dealings with the Aikikai almost always turn into problems when I give an honest answer about my training history. They hear the word Yoshinkan, and the old guard in particular seem to be immediately prejudiced against me. Other instructors and senior students rather comically focus on my judo and karate backgrounds, citing some rather revealing ignorance about how those are strength-based martial arts and have somehow tainted my Aikido practice. One instructor even once told me to stop doing basic calisthenics. Needless to say, these are insanely off base, as every martial art I've ever participated in very openly prioritizes technical ability over raw physicality. It's just that judo and karate generally don't, dissuade people from being physically fit in the way that some Aikido elements do. Also worth noting here that all of these criticisms usually are coming from older people. The young people generally don't care. Some are even interested to learn about the differences that I might offer. On the point about Yoshinkan Aikido, I've been told that my Aikido is just quote-unquote completely different by Aikikai proponents and must essentially be fixed. It is always ignored that half of my lineage is Aikikai, and that I've trained full-time in an Aikikai-affiliated university club for 3 years. Again, full-time, essentially. Any differences in my Aikido are remarkably superficial, and I'm more than capable of reproducing whatever method they want to see for the sake of an examination. Having said that, were my Aikido genuinely that different, I've often gently reminded people that I've been training for 20 years. It would be unlikely, if not remarkably unthoughtful and unserious of me, to not have developed a personalized Aikido style by now. It is worth noting that I know of other individuals similar to myself who have run into these same obstacles. Perhaps you may be thinking other Aikido organizations would be more receptive to me, but this has not been my experience generally speaking. I am always met with the same tribalistic line of rhetoric as to why what I've been doing for the last 2 decades is actually all wrong. It is all petty politics, and I find myself returning to the same question. Why is it that these systems are more interested in subordinating me and getting me to toe their respective organizational lines and narratives, rather than just integrating me into the training room? If a teacher or organization's goal is to raise the level of practitioners, why would you ever fight so hard to exclude someone who already comes pre-packaged with so much experience? Unfortunately, this isn't the only set of concerning circumstances I've encountered within Aikido and the Aikikai in particular. I am something of a footage connoisseur, as my longtime viewers on YouTube know. I enjoy looking at old film from older teachers in their prime and borrowing or experimenting with things that I like. I have frequently been told that these techniques are somehow wrong, or at best obsolete, or even not Aikikai. In some cases, I've even been told it's not proper Aikido, period, even though it's from the same organization as the person I'm showing it to. I've shown this footage to teachers and advanced students from time to time, and keep in mind, this is film of teachers from, again, their organization. This is their tradition I'm pulling from. a surprising amount of supposed authority figures will deny the quality of what they see and often not even know who these people are. Keep in mind, this is really awkward for me as I'm often considered an outsider, which is fine, but why is it that I apparently know more about these older teachers than these people do, who should, by all manners of measurement, be the stewards of tradition? A few times I have been bold enough to ask about why these techniques are thought to be obsolete, and I never get a straightforward answer. Most teachers give me the incredibly unimaginative equivalent of, "That's just not how we do it." My problem with this, however, is how is it okay for them to beat me over the head with what their idea of traditional or correct is, while disregarding all the Aikido that came before in their own tradition? The math doesn't exactly work out in their favor. It doesn't seem like these masters, supposedly, know anything about their own system prior to their lived experience. That's a little problematic. Finally, I've encountered people that I would ostensibly call reformers in the Aikido space. I think most of these people are genuinely well-intentioned, and I suppose I would have to increasingly count myself among their number, given the disappointing encounters I've just outlined. I move in some groups online, and I've seen some former Yoshinkan practitioners do their best to inject life into their practice after having split from the primary organization some years back. Meanwhile, I've also seen people try to breathe new life into Aikido in a more grassroots and individual way. If I must be blunt here, I think both approaches have failed to go anywhere. I've seen a lot of great ideas among circles of former Yoshinkan practitioners, but they almost always remain ideas. There seems to be no real energy to act upon them. Of the ideas that are acted upon, at least partially, they seem remarkably familiar. Start a new organization with new bylaws that, in a few generations, will at best likely lead to that era's practitioners right back to where we are now, because the new bylaws are kind of the same as the old bylaws, the ones that ultimately led to mismanagement of the organization and the split. The grassroots Aikido folks tend to be a bit more radical, which actually I generally approve of, but they are also basically invisible. I would count my own channel as part of this problem. I'm not completely unaware of that. My format of faceless talking head doesn't really do much, and at the end of the day, I think meaningful dissemination of ideas is always going to have to come back to some form of organizational structure. Although I do think it could be done in a much better way than what is currently on offer by major active Aikido organizations. So here are a couple of takeaways. The first of these is that the Aikikai, for all intents and purposes, has won the Aikido marketing Cold War. I'm not going to dive into the history here, but there was once a time when it wasn't clear that they would win, and Yoshinkan was trouncing them pretty badly. However, I think the still in power old guard within the Aikikai have been incapable of overcoming that mindset of cutthroat market competition. The Aikikai's organizational goal seems to primarily be the victory of their Aikido over other options in the market, rather than the actual quality of their system. My strong recommendation for the Aikikai would be to hand the reins of institutional power to instructors in their 40s and 50s. I won't sugarcoat it here. I think there are too many old men who have been making too many policy decisions for too damn long. And I know by some people's estimation, 40s and 50s isn't young enough, and I dare say they might have a point. Currently, the people running the Aikikai are like in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The world that these folks grew up in is so radically different from the teenagers and 20-year-olds that they really should be targeting to pull into the art. They are just kind of out of touch, not only perhaps because of their old biases that have long since been solved by market success, but also just because their lived experience is that radically different from the experience of the target demographic that they really should be focused on. The aforementioned marketing Cold War is over, so now it shouldn't be about domination, but reconciliation. You would think given Aikido's philosophy, that this would come as second nature to the upper brass, but it does not seem so. Speaking frankly, Aikido is insanely fragmented, and the Aikikai, I think, is largely to blame. I will not get into the weeds here, but in my own research and just through basic rumor, it seems like most offshoot organizations, even the ones that eventually went on to be big, were created because the Aikikai ultimately drove people out of their organization for being too heterodox. And for the record, I don't necessarily think this was the founder doing it. I think it was the people around the founder pushing a certain marketing narrative. I think we have better evidence for some of these cases than others, though. Circumstantially, remember that this is an organization, the Aikikai that is, that has been historically willing to edit photographs in order to control the narrative. So I wouldn't put it past them. In a world where the Aikikai's apparent strategy of divide, eject, and smother competition has largely succeeded, I'd very much like to see the Aikikai shift to a policy of reintegration. Rather than kick Yoshinkan refugees while they're down, why not have a policy that can seamlessly integrate them under the Aikikai umbrella? Why not have such a policy for all Aikido practitioners of any style? Because again, all these people are just errant, homeless bodies of skill and experience that can basically be incorporated into the Aikikai for free if that organization just stopped giving them the raw end of every deal. Consider, too, that this should be viable because it is incredibly clear that the Aikikai itself is not monolithic in what it considers to be proper Aikido, in quotes. Rather famously, after 4th degree black belt, you're basically allowed to do what you want with very little oversight from any kind of internal standardization organization or counselor, anything like that. But beyond that, we are living through a time in which, as I just pointed out earlier, even high-level teachers are ignorant in some cases to the very existence of some of their predecessors. The concept of a pure Aikido tradition simply does not exist, and it frankly never has. From Takeda's Daito Ryu to Ueshiba to the second Doshu and beyond, Aikido has changed significantly with every passing of the torch. And this is natural. Maybe it's time to stop pretending that tradition is something to be reactively curated and legitimacy something to be tightly arbitrated in favor of accepting that traditions are a fluid continuum. There is no such thing as a contaminated Aikido, and there never really was, in the same vein that there is no such thing as a pure or real Aikido. It's always changing. I know to some listeners, especially my peers and colleagues of a Yoshinkan background, might sound like I'm playing too fast and loose with standards of quality here. For a long time, the Yoshinkan solution to Aikido's lack of competition has been highly regulated standards. I would humbly suggest, as refugees might now be more aware of, that regulations only hold so long as the top brass holds. I know of far more Yoshinkan practitioners today that would suggest that the quality of their practice is generally in decline, despite well-intended standardization from the inception of the organization. My suggestion here is not a lack of standards, but judgment of a practitioner along the lines of their own goals. For a Tamiki/Shotokan Aikido practitioner, this may well be competitive success. For others, it might be how aesthetically beautiful a cooperative demonstration is. Historically, these two parties would probably be at one another's throats, claiming the other's approach is fundamentally inferior, incorrect, and a perversion of Aikido as an art. Meanwhile, some third and fourth parties in the background will be shouting something about returning to Ueshiba's methods or self-defense. The thing is that having a dojo that contains the Tamiki competitor and the aesthetics-focused practitioner isn't going to blow up your whole program. As long as both are being honest and transparent in their preferences and goals, and both are willing to compromise with each other on their training time, again, should be no big deal given Aikido's philosophical underpinnings. What is the worst that can possibly happen? The competitor's Aikido gets prettier and the demonstration guy's Aikido gets more competitively viable and both parties get more athletic? Oh no, progress! What a horrible outcome. I hope you can see my point here, though. I firmly believe the era of rigidly defined Aikido must be retired to the dustbin of history. Next, while I sympathize with the grassroots Aikido folks, many of whom I've had positive interactions with online, I don't think your project works without visibility. Aikido desperately needs ambassadors. Now, I'm not saying you need to be an MMA champion here because let's be real, Aikido as an art really isn't super good for MMA. This isn't something I say as an excuse, deflection, or concession to the MMA critic crowd. I really just think it's a characteristic of the style. Yes, you can adapt parts of it into competition, but I'll just say that there is a reason that practical Aikido's biggest advocates tend to be police, bouncers, bodyguards, and corrections officers. I will leave it at that. But I do think Aikido ambassadors need a couple things that historically the art has been atrocious about cultivating. First, I think you have to be a normal, sociable person. Sounds basic, but the loudest voices, especially in the English-speaking Aikido sphere, seem to always be weird, insane, or otherwise completely unrelatable. They are meme-worthy in the worst kind of way. That's not acceptable. Second, I don't think it is optional in 2025 to only know about Aikido stuff. Whether you like it or not, martial arts enthusiasts now can engage with tons of different martial arts, even knowing some basic features of rather obscure styles that they might never train. Aikido can no longer afford to live in this pocket dimension. Again, I'm not saying you must necessarily compete against other styles or something like that, but I do not think it would hurt to have some experience in them. Personally, my Aikido has only been improved by knowing how a judoka would grip me, or how a striker would behave if I tried to walk them down looking to isolate a limb. Gone are the days where teachers should be allowed to shrug off questions that relate to other systems. And a good ambassador should have at least some inkling about major players in the martial arts space. A good ambassador, nay, a good teacher, should know something about striking and grappling and groundwork. If nothing else, they should have thought about how to counter these things. Finally, an ambassador should be able to do visually cool and amazing things. I know a lot of the functionally minded people are going to groan dispassionate sighs at that statement, but I think this is just another symptom of being trapped in the Aikido bubble. The overwhelming number of people in any martial art are either beginners or people who don't even train yet but might be interested. I would suggest only 30% or less of people involved in martial arts are of an intermediate level and above, and probably only half of that, maybe only 10%, are advanced. Despite all the noise coming from teenagers online about good martial arts being when violence happens, an overwhelming number of people are mostly looking for an art that does cool things, but is still realistically accessible. We can run from it, we can deny it, we can whine about it all we like, but we live in the social media era. The aesthetics and athleticism of your style matter. It is these qualities through which you can communicate with the uninitiated. Now, I could get even more radical to conclude this video if I wanted. For example, personally, and I'm sure you kind of get the gist that I'm biased given my backstory here, I think belt ranks are dumb and outdated. They were a system devised by Judo's founder to mirror the grade system in schools so that he might better sell Judo to the school system. It is an arbitrary system that has never really measured skill all that objectively, which was created for literal children and has now, unfortunately, mutated into a breadcrumb-style monetization strategy that pop culture takes far, far too seriously on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. In my estimation, the only kind of licensure any martial arts system needs to give a person is a teacher's blessing to go off and start your own school using their brand, their school name, their name, etc. But outside of that, belt ranks are just kind of dumb, and in the era of social media, I think their value is only going to depreciate farther, because let's be real, No one cares about what someone's rank is if they are obviously talented. Are new people going to be more attracted to some dude with a 6th-degree black belt who is otherwise very mundane? Or are they going to go to the guy who's doing stuff they've never seen anywhere else before that just looks really cool? I know I bring him up often, but Shirakawa Ryuji sensei is an Aikido practitioner with 500,000 subscribers on a channel that is mostly in Japanese. I cannot recall for the life of me the last time I saw anyone in the comments section of his YouTube channel ask for his credentials. No one cares about his rank or his organization or his lineage even, because look at what he can do. On that note, when I went to the national Aikido demonstrations this year, there were hushed conversations all day around the venue expressing disappointment that Shirakawa Ryuji sensei wasn't going to be performing that day. He is far from the most institutionally important or powerful person in the Aikikai, yet arguably has more soft cultural power now than his whole organization. And undoubtedly, he commands more attention than any other Aikido practitioner in the world. A recent video with Aikido Journal's Josh Gold sensei estimated that Shirakawa Ryuji sensei has more subscribers than there are Aikido practitioners globally. Love it or hate it, he's a great person to model ambassadors for the style after, and no one cares about the dude's belt rank. The reality is that I think many Aikido people need to wake up here to the fact that aesthetics beat arguments, at least in the realm of marketing and popularity. As an example, most people watch MMA for aesthetics, narrative drama, and vicarious achievement, something that is pretty well documented. The conversation about functionalism, at least as it relates to a martial art's popular success and recognition, really doesn't have a whole lot of bearing, despite what noise online might make you believe. But make no mistake, if your aesthetics attract talent and athleticism, then they absolutely can be converted into functionality. These things are not unrelated. They are on the same spectrum. I simply believe that this is a lesson that, particularly for the grassroots reformer camp, they've not yet really learned to incorporate. Although I can't blame them, because plenty of other martial arts do not have seemed to have figured out this formula generally either. I'll conclude here with perhaps my most radical statement of this video. Judo's Kano invented his art essentially to rehabilitate the image of martial arts of his day, because he recognized that they were not appealing to or servicing the people and culture contemporary to himself. Alongside Kendo, Judo essentially began the Gendai Budo movement, if you want to call it a movement. Basically what that means is modern martial arts in the Japanese context. It was a departure from these old stagnant traditions. Now, I'm well aware that these old school martial arts are still around, and many of them will tell you that yes, we've changed over time, but other ones will swear up and down that they are a pure preservation project, which I think is actually very difficult to prove and maintain if you have a critical mind, but that's not here nor there. Online, a lot of people will say Judo was an art that took Japanese jiu-jitsu and modernized it. And in a way, sure. What the people talking about this in the West often sometimes mean, though, is they think he took an ineffective system and made it effective. That isn't really what happened. Judo's innovation was that he made it palatable to the people of his day. That's huge, and Aikido needs something like that, because increasingly, Aikido seems like it only serves people born between the years of like 1940 and 1970. I don't think modern Aikido, perhaps in any form, is really out there targeting modern Japanese people, and certainly not modern global people. I don't even think most systems, most organizations would even know really where to begin. Now, yes, I know that there are outposts and teachers that go abroad, but really as a project, that's shrunk considerably. The systems that we know as Gendai Budo essentially came into existence a little over 100 years ago. And I think it's well time for a second look will say. I'm not suggesting that these old institutions give up their power and resign themselves to being abolished or something silly like that, but I am saying that the status quo isn't serving anybody anymore, except, again, like the oldest people in these organizations, I think. It increasingly seems clear to me that institutional power has been cloistered away, and the eldest generation is just white-knuckling it until they inevitably pass away. But by the time they pass it on, their successors will be like 60 or 72, and it just makes revitalization super slow. Now, I'm not suggesting that we just give power to 20-year-olds because, as most people in most cultures will know, like 20-year-olds are basically just kids with more autonomy. They're sort of idiots. The flip side of that, though, is that a surprising amount of what became the Gendai Budo actually did happen in universities behind closed doors outside of the purview of their teachers. For better or for worse, the younger generation has a lot of creative momentum. It's not always good, it's certainly almost never organized, but it still has the ability to crystallize into something that can last for, well, a century. Aikido organizations, and indeed Aikido as an art, desperately needs a shakeup. I am extremely fatigued with the same problems, the same approaches, the same uninspired answers, the same tribalism, over and over and over again. I just want to see the art succeed. I want to see new talent rise up. I want to see more YouTube videos of young students really enjoying what they're doing. I want to see more people fit and passionate about this, and nothing about our calcified institutions seems to be supportive of that vision. That's a problem. It's a big problem. And I won't say it's existential, because the reality is that the status quo can limp along for a very long time. But the reality is that participation is down. And I know, I get it. Martial arts move in cycles, popularity moves in cycles, etc., etc. But I see a lot of people leaning into that explanation of things basically to just excuse their inactivity and their inability to come up with solutions. It's to excuse the status quo because they're not comfortable with stepping outside of it. But I just want to reiterate, I am not suggesting we reinvent the wheel here. I am not suggesting that you necessarily have to reinvent a curriculum. All I'm saying is, let's just get rid of this stupid, petty tribalism between arts that are basically the same at the end of the day. The differences between the different styles of Aikido are remarkably small compared to martial arts outside of them. Why can we not all just get together in a room and train? Who cares about ranks or institutional power or branding or whatever else? What we should care about is taking new people and making them as good as possible, because when we die, they will be the people who are passing it on, and they will remember about how they received the art. That needs to be the legacy that we are concerned with as Aikidoka. Nothing more and nothing less. I'll leave it at that, though. Feel free to leave your comments below. I am more than sure I've probably pressed buttons for some folks in this video, but everything I stated here really comes from a place of wanting to see Aikido do better. And I know there's always going to be that doomer or critic in the comments that will say, let it die. But like, whatever, man. Trust me, we're doing pretty well all on our own without you needing to put that down in my comments section. It almost seems like some of these organizations are out to kill the art on purpose. But I digress. There's just so many problems. I'm incredibly fatigued by how out of touch the whole space seems to be with the modern landscape, and in some cases how misplaced organizational priorities really appear to be. Too much petty tribalism, too much doing the same thing and expecting a different result, and too little actual reflection and tangible change. And for the record, I get that my video format is, again, not really helping anything. I've been putting a lot of thought recently into that, and I'm going to be exploring other video styles as we move into the new year and hopefully throughout 2026. Real life willing, of course. As always, thank you for watching and listening. There is no channel without you, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.